After a long day of traveling, you reach a small inn, Lady Luck. You cross its threshold, and as luck would have it, you're among the first patrons of the evening, but you won't be the last one. You pay for accommodations, you order food, have your fill, quench your thirst, and then move to the shared bedroom. In this chamber there are 6 beds, each one of them able to accommodate 3, even 4 people. You settle in, and before long, more and more patrons occupy other beds. A few moments later, 2 individuals stop at the foot of the bed you are occupying. They introduce themselves. One of them is of a larger build with a majestic black beard. His companion, short, lanky, balding, with a very well trimmed goatee. They are both very well clothed. They settle in bed next to you, and as the custom goes, you start making a little bit of chit-chat before going to bed. You find out that they are business owners from the south. They own a few smithies in several settlements. As chance has it, you are an ore merchant. Shortly thereafter, you start talking about prices and quantities and qualities, and before long, you strike a deal. The only thing you haven't had a chance of discussing is the cost of transport, but that can wait until tomorrow. Slowly, one by one, most of the candles are extinguished, with the exception of a few. Snores and bodily smells fill the air. You wish your bedmates a good night. You turn on your other side and smile at the chance of striking a deal. And before you fall asleep, a thought blooms into your mind. Lady Luck indeed smiled upon you tonight. Hello everyone, and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. Today we will be talking about something we are all more familiar with: inns and general sleeping accommodations in medieval times. There are many misconceptions that circulate about medieval sleeping accommodations, and then we're gonna clarify a few of them during today's episode. Before we start, let me list the things we are going to talk about today. We're gonna be talking about medieval couchsurfing. It sounds weird, but you'll get the point. Then we're gonna be talking about hospitals, monasteries, and inns in general. And with that, before we start our story today, let's talk about the miniature. This is Solan, the Persian warlock from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. Before we start talking about what I call medieval couchsurfing, it is quite important to understand how people slept. For the longest of times, sleep was a communal experience. This was because people needed warmth, people needed security, it was enjoyable, and they didn't have enough room not to do so. Beds, as we know them today, raised beds, became a common thing only starting with the 15th century onward. People knew the concept of a raised bed, people had them from ancient times, but only the wealthy, first of all, could afford a raised bed, metal, carved wood, and other materials. And only the wealthy had enough room to have such beds. Imagine the commoners. Most people had cottages or small houses, a one-chamber house. This chamber was at the same time kitchen, dining room and bedroom. Now imagine you had a multi-generational household. Let's imagine you had a pair of grandparents, a pair of parents, and 5 children, which was a normal occurrence in medieval times. You already had 9 people in the same space. You couldn't fit 9 beds, or 3 beds, or even a single bed in there. As such, people used to sleep beside the fire on the floor. They used pelts, furs, rugs, whatever came in handy. Now, with them sleeping in front of the fire, imagine that in the middle of this group of people were the youngest members of the household, the youngest children. They needed the most warmth, and they needed to be well protected. As you start moving outwards, you have older and older members of the household. On one side, you had the youngest daughter in the middle, and then every daughter, every woman of the household until you reached the eldest. And on the other side, you had the youngest son, and then moving outwards till you reached the eldest male of the household. With that being said, this was a hovel. Merchants or craftsmen were better off in medieval times as they were in ancient times. They could perhaps afford larger houses, but most of the times they would sleep in the same arrangement. Perhaps they had wooden benches or a stone plinth next to the oven or the fireplace to keep warm, but in most cases a larger house meant that you had an extra room that was a pantry. You could stockpile food, which was a big deal. When it came to noble individuals, they had mansions, they had estates, they had larger houses, they had more rooms. But even in those cases, people slept in the same space. Usually they would have a raised bed showing off their rank in society. And then on either side, or both sides, you had smaller lower beds in which either the chamberlain or the chambermaid would sleep, and or the children on the other side, on lower, smaller beds, but still in the same room. With that being said, let me explain what medieval couchsurfing meant. Let's say you were traveling from point A to point B, and on the way you had to spend the night somewhere. If there were no inns available, or you didn't have enough money for an inn, you could simply knock on somebody's door and ask for shelter for the night. That was common practice. People didn't fear strangers and weren't that creeped out by these situations as we are today. Now, you wouldn't allow somebody in your house that wasn't of the same standing, the same rank in society or higher. That meant that a peasant would be able to knock on a peasant's door and spend the night, perhaps, but wasn't able to do so at a merchant's house or a noble's house. But a merchant could spend the night at another merchant or a peasant. A nobleman could spend the night at another nobleman, at a merchant or a peasant. That didn't mean that they paid for their accommodation. This is how news spread. This is how stories spread. This is how rumors spread. Merchants would exchange information about prices, would be able to strike up conversations and reach deals. This was the most reliable method of spreading news in the medieval times. Moreover, you would, of course, if everything went well, you could forge a bond. You could have the individual house you if you were traveling through their settlement. Now, there were some unspoken rules. First off, if you were to spend the night in somebody's house, you would sleep either next to the father on the outside of a row of people, or on the opposite side in the colder corner, in a very cramped space. It didn't matter. You had somewhere to sleep. Another rule was that if you didn't have enough room in your house, you could offer, it wasn't a rule, it was a practice, you could offer space in your stables. Stables are an interesting thing. Most hovels, most single-chambered dwelling in the rural areas had their stables built right up against the house. You would have there cows, goats, sheep, horses, donkeys, pigs, whatever. Now, you could imagine the smell, but please don't be under the impression that medieval people or ancient people didn't wash. That's bullshit. We're gonna talk about this in another video at another time. But still, you would smell stables. Another rule was that you wouldn't allow somebody that was shady looking in your house. If they weren't clean, if they smelled very bad, if they had a very twitchy, shady, creepy look about them, you wouldn't allow them inside. And the last and most important aspect, and this is the segue for the next discussion, you wouldn't allow anybody that was sick looking in your house. Disease was a huge problem in medieval times, as it was in ancient times. Disease is a problem up until the 19th century, more or less. You wouldn't allow anybody that was sick looking in your house. The same goes even for inns. If you looked too sick, you wouldn't be allowed to sleep in the shared bedrooms. The medieval couchsurfing that I've described here can also be found in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, for example, where you have under the background folk hero rustic hospitality. And for noble, you have position of privilege. With this being said, let us talk about the miniature before we move on. Using brighter and brighter shades of yellow, I am highlighting the shawl on the head of the miniature, painting only its highest points, making sure that the creases are left a darker shade of yellow to simulate shadows. Now, using Rhinox hide, I am painting the leather belt the mini has around its waist, making sure to cover it properly. Highlights are added using Katachan flash, again catching the raised points and lines of the belt to give the illusion of light hitting it. Adding a little Administratum Grey to the Katachan flash, I am adding the final touches to the leather belt, making it look a little dull, a little worn, a little chafed. Again, hitting only the most obvious details on the belt. Now that we've talked about medieval couchsurfing, let's talk about hospitals, and it's in relation to something I've mentioned before. In medieval times, hospitals were a place of charity. Let me explain. When you were sick and traveling in medieval times, people didn't want you around them. People didn't offer sleeping accommodations. So you had to sleep somewhere. Not all settlements had hospitals, of course, but those that did housed for free the sick, the beggars, those shady enough to not be allowed in people's houses, and those who didn't have anything to their name, so the downtrodden. This is a place that even peasants avoided. If you had to spend a night at a hospital, it meant you were in a very, very bad place in your life. The name hospital derives from the ancient Roman hospitia or hospitales, which means hospitable. These were charitable places where people would find shelter and would be given some food. Now, if you wanted to care for the sick, you would go to hospitals because that's where they were housed. In time, the hospital evolved into meaning a place where you exclusively take care of the sick. This is where the Knights Hospitaller got their name from. The Order of Knights of the Hospital of Saint John of Jerusalem. This is where it started from. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about one other housing accommodation that was available to travelers. And those were monasteries. Christians, through the dogma, had an obligation to be charitable and offer housing and food. Of course, there were people who abused this charitable service. As such, there were many monasteries that had specially assigned dormitories just for travelers. Now, inns. But before we get to inns, let's talk about the miniature for a moment. Now that the tassels have been painted with Retributor armor, I am using Aerial Yellow and Flesh Gits Yellow to add the finishing touches to them, making sure that the highlights are all in place and make sure that they make the miniature pop. As you can see, this is a very laborious process and it takes quite a bit, but I'm quite happy with the results. As you can see, the highlights are all there and the tassels are looking perfect, worthy of Solan. Now, using Stormhost Silver, I am touching up all the metal bits and pieces that Solan is carrying on him, preparing them for the final details. Let us continue. Before we talk about inns, the main attraction, let's circle back to beds, because it's quite interesting and quite telling and quite important to our story. Let me ask you this. Is it more resource efficient to construct 3 single-person beds or 1 single 3-person beds? If your answer is 1 bed that could accommodate 3 people, you are right. In fantasy stories, usually the adventuring party would get several rooms for individual party members, which is totally fine. It's not an issue, it's not a mistake. It's a fantasy world. But in reality, you wouldn't have a single room with a single bed for a single person. That wouldn't be cost effective, unless you were housing the ruler and doing so quite often. But in normal situations, you would have larger beds that accommodated several individuals and perhaps even in a shared room. It wasn't as strange as it is for us today to share a bed with a total stranger. This meant that you would exchange information, rumors, stories, even strike bargains. It was an opportunity for people. This is how news spread, this is how rumors spread, and this is how disease spread. But again, we've touched upon that. Even in inns, if you were looking sick enough, you wouldn't be allowed. Now, inns also offered food for their patrons, but the dining hall, although shared, was not public. You couldn't just come in and order dinner or lunch and eat and then leave. They would serve food only to their patrons. For food and drinks in a public place, such as a tavern or other establishments, you had to go in different places. And with that, I believe we have touched upon one of the most intriguing and important topic when it comes to world building and fantasy worlds. People would sleep next to one another in most situations. And this bit of information could be used in your world building, in your fantasy world, to create intriguing situations. Have your party share a room, share a bed with traveling merchants, with traveling peasants that tell them about their plight, about goblins attacking their village, or rumors about monstrous creatures stalking the woods and the fields around the village. Have them take up shelter in a merchant's house. Perhaps find out about the situation, about the economic situation in the capital, in the settlement, in the surrounding area. Or perhaps even allow them the opportunity to convince a nobleman to offer them shelter. And in doing so, being able to forge some relations, or perhaps infiltrate the nobleman's house and assassinate them. The opportunities are endless and are only limited by your imagination and the way you want to play this. I'm not saying that any of the ways you are using your sleeping accommodations in your world is wrong. Again, everybody has their own little set of rules, their vision upon the world, especially if it's a world you are building from scratch. But having an anchor in reality could offer more depth, could offer more insight, could offer more opportunities. Why try to reinvent the wheel when you already have a working one? I truly hope that you found some inspiration in today's episode, or at least found out something new. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, hit the bell, and I'll see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.